Hi, this is Pastor Paul. Today we're going to be talking about something that we can become preoccupied with, and that's death. You may be an individual that thinks about death a lot, and I'm talking about your own personal death, or you may be somebody of a certain age, maybe you're over 60 and it becomes a preoccupation. In my own personal life, it wasn't until I turned 60 that it became something that I found myself being immersed in, this concept of dying. I mean, I've always known I was going to die, but it's like you could see it from where I'm at. You know, once you're in your 60s, you start working the numbers and you're like, well, okay, I got 20 Christmases, I'm going to, only 18 more turkeys. How old are my grandchildren going to be when I die? Will I see them get married? You start working numbers in your head. For me, some of the passwords that I used to use for different logins was my father's, the date of his death. And it was interesting that I would mark my father's life by his death. And so this became an overwhelming preoccupation with me, to the point where it can make you think about why live. I mean, if we're going to die anyway, and then you start looking over your shoulder to see what it is that's going to kill you. It was so immersive, this idea of dying and death, and I really needed God to help me out of it, to be able to live courageously forward instead of thinking about death all the time. So God brought me through a couple things in the scriptures that I thought were really interesting. In the Old Testament, the people of God, as they traveled together, had these rules that were to reflect the narrative of God, how he wanted them to experience life, how he wanted them to be fruitful and create environments of life. So he established some of these rules that seemed really kind of odd. Like, for instance, if you touched anything that was dead, whether it was an animal or whether it was a person, even having to bury a loved one, that you were removed from outside of the camp of Israel because you were at that point unclean. And usually that process lasted for about 7 days. But if you had touched anything dead, you had to leave the camp. And this worked its way in a lot of different things, even fluids from animals that were dead, or even it included menstrual cycles, representing the unfertilized egg and the death of the egg, and that you were unclean for 7 days, and then you went through a cycle of purification, and you were now allowed to come back into the camp. This seemed really extreme, but when you begin to look at it, God wanted us to be marked by life. We experience death, and God created it so that, if you experienced death, it wasn't like you were kicked out of being an Israelite or a Jewish person or a person of promise, but he wanted to show that what the people of God were to be marked by was not by their deaths, but rather by their lives, and that we were supposed to be places where there was life happening, life in marriage, life in family, life in community, life, spiritual life, and so we were always called to reflect that. So when Jesus invites people to come follow him, he encounters a man who says, I'll follow you, Jesus, but let me first go and bury my father. And Jesus says something that sounds incredibly insensitive. He says, let the dead bury the dead. And in the light of what we learned from the Old Testament and the intention of God for all people in relationship with him, was that he wants us to flourish. He wants to be a community of flourishing. And he was saying, if you're going to mark the movements of your life based upon deaths, then you'll probably get nowhere. And so when I began to look at this personally, I was beginning to realize that all my future moments were being marked with death. Well, I'll only do this a certain amount of times. Well, I'll probably never see that person again. Or I wonder if that's how I'm going to die. And so depression began to set in because everything was marked with death. And God challenged me, but I don't want your thoughts focusing on that. Just like the people who were removed from the camp because of touching death, that there are thoughts that we need to remove from our minds that we do not have permission from God to think about. He does not want us to be a community of death. He wants us to be a community of abundant life. He wants our thoughts to be about our lives and the life that we bring at this particular moment into other people's lives. Will we experience death? Yes, but even Paul said, we sorrow not as those who don't have hope, meaning that we're not a people who are defined by our deaths, but rather we're defined by our lives. We encounter death, but yet it isn't a definition of who we are. And so it really kind of encouraged my heart to, from now on, as I begin to think about my life moving forward, that the terms of my death, the length of my life, how many more of these I'm going to have, how many, will I see my grandchild get married? Those are not thoughts that I'm given permission to think about. And there are other thoughts. I'm not given permission by God to be jealous of my neighbor. I'm not given permission by God to think about my neighbor's wife. This isn't the first time God challenges thoughts in us, as those thoughts reflect what the intention of his community is to be with us. So let me just challenge you. If you are obsessed with death, if you're obsessed by your own death, if you have an anxiety or a depression that is set on into your life, maybe you turned 60, let me just challenge you to start thinking differently, to not think about your death and don't mark life by death, but rather to mark life by the life that you bring into other people's lives and the life that God brings into you. Maybe it's time for all of us to go back and possibly change our passwords. And instead of celebrating the death of a person, we celebrate the life of that person. Just a thought. Have a good day.